Every morning, Grace woke up at 5 o'clock, not because she was excited about the day ahead, but because her body had learned over decades that the world belonged to those who moved first. She would shuffle through the small apartment in her worn slippers, the same pair she had owned for 3 years, and make coffee in a mug that had lost its handle years ago. She held it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into her fingers, trying to feel something other than the cold emptiness that seemed to have become her permanent companion. Grace was 63 years old, and she had become invisible. Not overnight. It happened slowly, like a fade to black in a film nobody was watching. She had spent 40 years raising 3 children. She had worked as a nurse, then as a secretary, then as a cleaner in office buildings. She had sacrificed her youth, her dreams, her entire identity for the people she loved. Now, those people had their own lives. They had their own families, their own ambitions, their own worlds that had no room for a quiet, aging woman who had nothing left to offer them. Her eldest son, Michael, had become a successful lawyer. He lived on the other side of the city with his wife and 2 children. He called Grace on her birthday and sometimes on Christmas. During those calls, there would be awkward silences filled with the white noise of obligation. He would ask her how she was doing, and she would say she was fine. She was always fine. That was what Grace had learned to be. Fine, invisible, acceptable, forgotten. Her daughter, Sarah, was a marketing executive. She traveled constantly, always chasing the next promotion, the next achievement. She rarely visited. When she did, she would look at her mother's apartment with barely concealed disapproval, commenting on the outdated furniture or the faded wallpaper. Grace would smile and nod, never mentioning that she didn't have the money to update anything, never mentioning that she was putting every penny toward paying rent and buying medication for the arthritis that made her hands ache. Her youngest, David, was the one who hurt her the most. David had dropped out of college, and Grace had supported him financially and emotionally, convinced that he would find his way. But now, at 35, he lived in her apartment, sleeping until noon, contributing nothing but complaints about how limited life was, how unfair the world had treated him. He looked at his mother with something close to contempt, as if her presence in his life was a reminder of his own failures. Once, when she had suggested he find employment, he had said something that still echoed in her mind. "You've done nothing with your life. Mom, you have no right to lecture me." Those words had carved themselves into her heart. She replayed them every night when she couldn't sleep, which was most nights. Grace's days followed the same rhythm. She would clean her small apartment, prepare simple meals she often ate alone, and spend her afternoons sitting by the window, watching the world move past her. She had a pension that barely covered her expenses. She had a few friends from her nursing days, but they had grown busy with grandchildren and travel plans. The phone rarely rang. Her email received mostly spam and bills. She had hobbies once. She loved gardening, and her home used to overflow with plants and flowers. She loved reading, losing herself in stories about people whose lives were more interesting than her own. She loved painting, though that was something she had set aside decades ago, back when her children were young and there was no time for such self-indulgences. She had been good at painting. In art school, before life had demanded her attention, her teachers had said she had real talent. But talent doesn't pay bills, and dreams don't feed children. So she had packed away her brushes and her dreams, and she had become what the world needed her to be. A servant, a support system, a background character in everyone else's story. Now, sitting in her apartment on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Grace felt the weight of her insignificance pressing down on her chest. She was a woman who had given everything and received nothing. She was a woman whose life had mattered to nobody. She was a woman counting down the years until her life would be over, until her absence would be as unnoticed as her presence. What Grace didn't know was that her story was about to change in a way that would shock everyone who had ever dismissed her. What she didn't know was that buried inside her, beneath decades of sacrifice and silence, lay a power that would make the world stop and take notice. What she didn't know was that sometimes the most extraordinary moments arrive when we have already given up hope of anything remarkable ever happening to us. It started with a simple discovery. Grace was moving a storage box in her bedroom closet when it slipped from her hands and fell to the floor, scattering its contents everywhere. As she knelt down to pick up the pieces, she found them, her old painting supplies, brushes that had been untouched for nearly 30 years, canvas that had yellowed with age, tubes of paint, some of them dried out, others still containing color. She held a brush in her trembling hand, feeling the weight of lost time pressing down on her. She could almost remember the feeling of painting, the way it had made her feel alive, the way a blank canvas had felt like infinite possibility. She could almost remember the woman she had been before responsibility had consumed her, before she had learned to make herself small and invisible. David was asleep in the living room, sprawled on the couch like always. Sarah was in another city, climbing another rung of a corporate ladder that would never be tall enough. Michael was in his house, living his successful life, probably not thinking about his mother at all. And Grace, alone in her bedroom, made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She would paint again. That first canvas was tentative, uncertain. Her hands were stiff, and her mind couldn't quite remember the techniques she had learned so many decades ago. But as she applied the first brush strokes, something shifted inside her. It was as if a door that had been locked for 30 years was suddenly opening. Color flowed from her brush onto the canvas. Emotion that she had suppressed for decades began to emerge in the form of shapes and hues and abstract patterns that she didn't even know she possessed. That first painting took her 3 weeks to complete. It was called Silence, and it was dark blues and deep purples, with threads of silver running through it like light breaking through darkness. When she finished it, she stood back and stared at it for a long time. She didn't know if it was good. She had no way to judge anymore, but it made her feel something. It made her feel like Grace, not just the empty shell she had become. She started painting every day after that. She would wake up early, make her coffee, and retreat to her bedroom, where she had set up a small workspace. She painted while David slept. She painted while the world moved on without her. She painted because for the first time in decades she felt like she had a reason to be alive beyond just existing. Her paintings were extraordinary, though she didn't realize it yet. They were emotional landscapes that seemed to capture the texture of human suffering and resilience. They were portraits that looked like dreams, distorted and beautiful and heartbreaking. They were abstract compositions that made viewers feel things they couldn't name. Each painting was a conversation between her brush and the deepest parts of her soul. Within a year, she had created 30 paintings. They covered every wall of her apartment, transforming it from a place of emptiness into a gallery of raw emotion. She had spent money she didn't have on supplies, justifying it as a small luxury, something she deserved after all these years of self-denial. One day, her daughter Sarah visited unexpectedly. She was passing through the city and had decided to stop by her mother's apartment for an hour. She walked in without removing her shoes, ready to spend the minimum amount of time required before leaving for her next appointment. And then she saw the paintings. Sarah froze in the doorway. She looked around the apartment, seeing it as if for the first time, seeing past the dated furniture and worn carpets to the walls that were covered with art that was breathtakingly beautiful and painfully honest. "Mom," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you paint these?" Grace nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her work. She had never intended for anyone to see them. They were private conversations between her and her own existence. Sarah walked from painting to painting, studying each one with an intensity that Grace had never seen from her daughter before. Tears began to stream down Sarah's face. "These are incredible," she finally said. "These are truly incredible. I can't believe you created these." For the first time in years, Sarah looked at her mother with something other than judgment or indifference. She looked at her with awe. That same week, Sarah did something that would change everything. She took photographs of 3 of Grace's paintings and sent them to a friend of hers who owned an art gallery. She didn't tell her mother what she was doing. She simply sent the images with a brief message. "My mother painted these. I think they deserve to be seen." The gallery owner, a woman named Victoria with an eye for genuine talent, responded within an hour. She wanted to meet Grace. She wanted to see the paintings in person. She was convinced that Grace's work was exceptional, and she wanted to exhibit it in her gallery. Grace received the email while sitting alone in her apartment. She read it 3 times before she fully understood what it said. For the first time in 63 years, someone outside her family was acknowledging her work. Someone was seeing her not as an invisible woman, not as a failed mother, not as a nothing. Someone was seeing her as an artist. The gallery exhibition opened on a Friday night in the fall. The invitation read, "Grace Chen, a life revealed through color," and beneath that, a single line. A retrospective of the artist who stopped creating to raise a family and found her voice again. Grace had never been to a gallery opening before. She owned only one nice dress, which she had bought 15 years ago for a funeral. She stood in front of her mirror that evening, studying her reflection, and barely recognized herself. Her hands, which had always been rough and worn, now bore traces of paint under the fingernails. Her face, which had always been lined with tiredness, now showed something else. Expectation. Hope. Michael attended the opening because Sarah had insisted. He walked into the gallery with his wife, expecting to spend an hour supporting his mother out of obligation. What he found instead was a room filled with more than 200 people, crowded around paintings that he realized, with a shock that made his breath catch, had been created by his mother. He stood in front of a painting called Invisible. It was a portrait of a woman whose features were slowly fading away, becoming transparent, dissolving into the background. The pain in that image was so raw, so honest, that Michael felt tears burning behind his eyes. He recognized that pain. He had seen it in his mother's face for years and had chosen to ignore it. David came to the opening too. He stood in front of a painting called Silence After Giving Everything and felt something break inside him. The painting showed two hands, open and empty, with all of their color being pulled away into darkness. He finally understood what he had done to his mother. The weight of his own failure that he had placed on her shoulders. The way he had blamed her for his own inadequacy. The night was a triumph. 3/4 of the paintings sold within the first 2 hours. Gallery visitors approached Grace asking about her process, her inspiration, her artistic vision. She spoke haltingly at first, unaccustomed to being the center of attention, unaccustomed to being listened to. But as the night progressed, she began to find her voice. She talked about the decades of silence. She talked about the cost of sacrifice. She talked about discovering that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. By the end of the evening, every painting had been sold. The total came to exactly $1 million. The news spread quickly. Stories about Grace appeared in local newspapers, then regional ones, then national media outlets. Woman discovers art career at 63, the headlines read. Mother of 3 becomes $1 million artist overnight. Her story resonated because it was everyone's story in some way. The story of dreams deferred, of potential buried under years of responsibilities, of the human need to create and be seen and matter. Galleries in other cities wanted to exhibit her work. She received offers from collectors, museums, and investors. She was invited to speak at art schools and women's conferences. She became the subject of a documentary. Her paintings were displayed in exhibitions that traveled across the world. Within 6 months, she was one of the most celebrated artists of her generation. The money was overwhelming. Grace had spent her entire life stretched thin, carefully calculating every expense, every purchase. Now she could buy whatever she wanted. She could travel. She could support herself without worry. She could give gifts to her children, though she chose not to, preferring to let them experience their own guilt. Michael visited his mother and apologized. He told her that he had been a terrible son, that he had failed to see her, that he had taken for granted everything she had done for him. He cried in her apartment, his successful life suddenly feeling hollow and meaningless. Grace forgave him, as she had always forgiven everyone, but this time, she forgave him without erasing herself in the process. Sarah began visiting regularly, bringing her nieces and nephews to see their grandmother's studio. She watched her mother work, watched the way she moved with confidence and purpose, and she realized that she had inherited something from Grace that she had never recognized before. The same creative spark, the same artistic sensibility. She began to paint herself, following the path that her mother had opened. David struggled the most with Grace's transformation. His mother's success was a mirror held up to his own failures, and he couldn't bear to look at it. He moved out of the apartment, unable to face her anymore. But before he left, Grace gave him a painting. It was called Redemption, and it was his portrait in progress, unfinished, full of potential. She told him that it wasn't too late for him either, that every life contained the possibility of change and growth and transformation. She told him that she loved him and always would, even when he couldn't love himself. The world watched as Grace's life unfolded like one of her paintings, layer by layer revealing new colors, new depths, new meanings. She had been invisible for so long, and now she was impossible to ignore. But more importantly, she had finally learned to see herself. 6 months after her first exhibition, Grace created her most important work. She called it The Unfinished Life, and it was a massive canvas that took up an entire wall of her studio. The painting showed a woman standing at the edge of an ocean at sunrise. Her back was to the viewer, and her arms were outstretched as if she was about to step into the water, about to dissolve into something infinite and eternal. But what made the painting extraordinary was what Grace had done with the details. The woman's hair was made of brushstrokes that included memories, childhood moments, children being born, sleepless nights, hands holding other hands, sacrifices both seen and unseen. Her dress was woven from colors that represented emotions. The purple of sadness, the gold of hidden pride, the gray of numbness, the brilliant blue of sudden joy. Behind her, the sky was transitioning from darkness to light, from the night of her forgotten years to the dawn of her discovery. It took her 4 months to complete. She worked on it every single day, often painting late into the night. She poured every ounce of her emotional being into this canvas. It was her masterpiece, the sum total of everything she had experienced and suffered and finally overcome. When she stepped back from it for the last time, she wept. She had never created anything so honest, so profound, so essential. This painting was the story of her life, and the story of every woman who had ever been told that her dreams didn't matter, that her potential was secondary to everyone else's needs, that she was meant to be invisible. Gallery owner Victoria saw the painting and immediately knew that this piece would define Grace's legacy. She suggested that Grace never sell it, that she donate it to a major museum so that it could touch millions of lives over generations. Grace agreed, but she asked for one thing: that the painting be displayed with a plaque that told the truth about its creation. The plaque read, "The Unfinished Life by Grace Chen, created by an artist who spent 63 years becoming invisible before finally discovering that her voice mattered." This painting is dedicated to all the women who sacrifice their dreams for others, and to the courage it takes to reclaim yourself. The painting was donated to the National Museum of Art and displayed in a place of honor. Thousands of people came to see it. Women cried in front of it. Men stared at it in silent contemplation. Young people saw it and made different choices about their own lives. The painting became more than art. It became a catalyst for change, a symbol of redemption, a testament to the power of human resilience. Grace gave interviews to journalists, and in each one she spoke about the cost of invisibility. She talked about how women, especially older women, are systematically erased from society. She talked about how talent and intelligence and beauty go unnoticed because we are taught not to see them. She talked about the waste of potential that happens every day in homes across the world. She also talked about grace, the actual grace, the kind that appears when you least expect it. She talked about the grace of second chances, the grace of discovery, the grace of being seen and valued and loved. She said that her name, which had seemed like a burden during her invisible years, had become her truth. She had lived a life of grace, and she had finally learned to recognize it. Her story inspired a movement. Women's groups organized exhibitions showcasing the work of older, overlooked artists. Galleries dedicated special programming to artists who had sacrificed their careers for their families. Universities established scholarships for women returning to their creative pursuits later in life. Grace's example became a permission structure for countless women to reclaim the parts of themselves that they had buried. Michael used his legal expertise to help other women protect their intellectual property and ensure fair compensation for their work. He established a foundation in his mother's name to support emerging female artists. He published a book about his mother's life and called it The Price of Invisibility: My Mother's Journey to Being Seen. Sarah left her corporate job to pursue art full-time, creating work that was deeply influenced by her mother's example. She opened a studio in the same building as her mother, and they worked side by side, creating in companionable silence, supporting each other in ways they never had before. David eventually reached out to his mother. He had entered therapy and began to deal with his own struggles with self-worth and depression. He told Grace that watching her reclaim her life had saved his own. He apologized for the pain he had caused and asked if he could help her with her art. Together, they built the studio that would serve as Grace's creative sanctuary for the rest of her life. Years passed, and Grace continued to paint. Her work evolved and deepened. She painted the beauty of aging, the wisdom that comes from lived experience, the strength that emerges from surviving loss and disappointment. She painted love in all its forms: romantic love, parental love, self-love, the love between sisters and brothers, the love of strangers who became friends. She painted the texture of human existence in all its messy, complicated, glorious reality. Her exhibitions traveled around the world. Her paintings hung in the homes of celebrities and world leaders, in the offices of Fortune 500 companies, and in the modest apartments of people who saved for years to buy a single piece of her work. She won every major art prize available. She was honored at ceremonies, featured in documentaries, written about in academic papers. She became one of the most important artists of her generation. Her work studied in art schools and discussed in university seminars. But despite all of this success, Grace remained fundamentally changed by the years of invisibility. She never forgot what it was like to be unseen. She never took for granted the privilege of being heard. She used her platform to speak for others who didn't have one. She established grants for overlooked artists. She mentored younger creatives, particularly women and minorities who had experienced discrimination and erasure. She gave generously to causes that supported senior citizens and people living in poverty. She moved to a beautiful house with large windows that overlooked a garden where she grew flowers and vegetables. She traveled to see the world she had only read about in books. She made friends and went to dinner parties and allowed herself to experience joy without guilt. She learned that being kind to herself was not selfish, that meeting her own needs was not indulgent, that she deserved to take up space in the world. The apartment where she had lived in invisibility for so many years was preserved as a museum. People visited it to see the cramped bedroom where she had created her first paintings, the small kitchen where she had made simple meals, the window where she had watched the world pass by. They stood in these spaces and felt the weight of her silence, the burden of her unacknowledged talent, and they walked away with a deeper understanding of how much human potential goes to waste because we have failed to see each other. Grace lived to be 91 years old. Her final painting, completed just weeks before her death, was called The Color of Forever. It was luminous, filled with light and warmth and a sense of completion. Critics called it her most beautiful work, a perfect culmination to a life dedicated to teaching the world about the power of seeing and being seen. When she died, her obituary appeared in newspapers worldwide. World leaders expressed their condolences. Museums held exhibitions of her work in her honor. A major motion picture about her life was announced. But the most important tributes came from the ordinary people whose lives she had touched. From women who had recognized themselves in her paintings and had been inspired to pursue their own dreams. From men who had learned from her example to truly see the women in their lives. From young people who understood that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. Grace had spent 63 years being invisible. She spent the final 28 years of her life creating work that made her impossible to ignore. She learned that the world doesn't bestow visibility on us. We must claim it. She learned that our dreams don't expire. They wait patiently for us to be brave enough to pursue them. She learned that age is not a limitation. It is a repository of everything we have survived and learned and become. Her legacy is not just in the paintings she left behind, though those paintings will continue to inspire and move people for generations. Her legacy is in the lives she touched, the women she inspired to reclaim themselves, the families she healed through her honest example, the world she helped to see more clearly and love more deeply. If you are watching this, and you feel like Grace, like you are invisible, like your dreams were left behind somewhere in the rush of responsibilities and obligations, I want you to know something. It is not too late. Your voice matters. Your talent matters. Your life matters. The world needs what only you can create. The specific beauty that only your hands and your heart and your mind can bring into existence. Don't wait until you are 63. Don't wait until you are 80. Don't wait for permission or approval or the perfect moment. Start today. Start now. Reclaim the part of yourself that you have been hiding, because once you do, once you step into your own power and allow yourself to be seen, the world will never be the same, and neither will you. Thank you for watching Grace's story. If her journey moved you, if it made you think about your own life and your own dreams, please leave a comment below and share what Grace's transformation meant to you. Subscribe to this channel to hear more stories about ordinary people who discovered extraordinary purpose. Because we all have a Grace inside us, waiting to be seen.